Good evening and welcome to our public forum on school funding and property taxes, two issues that are not only likely to be on people's minds as they cast their ballot this fall, but that are almost certainly going to be near the top of the legislature's agenda when it convenes in January. My name is Jeff McLynch, and I'm the project director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, a nonprofit advocacy organization that seeks to inform the public about the system New Hampshire uses to fund its public schools and to advocate for reforms to make it more equitable and sustainable. I'll serve as both your host and moderator for this evening's event. And our forum tonight will really consist of three parts. I'll start with a brief overview of New Hampshire school funding system and some of the problems before that. And following that overview, we'll be joined by three guests. Our first is Liz Kerwin, who is a New Hampshire Teacher of the Year nominee, who teaches English language learners at Manchester High School West. She also serves as the chair of the Manchester Proud Champions Council. Lisa Stone will be our next guest speaker. She's a realtor from Peterborough and a member of that town's planning board. A Granite State native, Lisa graduated from Scenic Regional High School just about the time the Claremont cases were getting underway. And she and her two children are also proud graduates of New Hampshire Public Schools. Our third speaker for the evening will be Norm Turcott. Norm is a longtime Bedford resident and the former president and CEO of Associated Grocers of New England. All three of those speakers will share a little bit about their thoughts on school funding and their experiences and how it's affected their communities. Then we'll turn to candidates for the New Hampshire House of Representatives and Senate, and we'll recognize those folks who've indicated they wish to speak. I'll recognize each of them in alphabetical order out of fairness, except for those people with the last name beginning in Z. I do want to ask that folks please limit their remarks to 2 minutes. There are a substantial number of people who wish to speak, so we just want to make sure everybody has equal time. And then we'll open the floor to questions from the public. We have received a few questions with people's advanced registrations, and we'll try to give those priority. But then as time allows, we'll turn to people here tonight. And I do want to emphasize, if you have a question, please feel free to enter it into the Q&A feature on your screen. Before I introduce our candidates this evening, there are two logistical matters I want to cover. The first is that all members of the public who are attending tonight will do so just in listen-only mode. But again, if there are time for questions at the end, or sufficient time for questions at the end, we'll try to recognize people correctly so that they can pose them in their own voice. The second logistical thing that I want to remind folks of is that we are recording this event, and we will share the recording of this event with everyone sometime tomorrow. We'll probably need to edit out the first little bit and make sure it's functioning well, but we'll also post it to the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project website so that people who don't have the benefit of being able to attend tonight can come back and listen to what everybody has to say. So with that, why don't I go ahead and introduce our candidates who have registered to attend tonight. And I'll try to do this at pace because it's a long list. But we have Executive Counselor Deborah Pignatelli with us tonight, along with Senate candidates Jennifer Dalford-Keister. I believe Senator D'Alessandro may be joining us as well. Gene Deach from the 9th Senate District, George Lambert from Senate 18, and Mary Ellen McKay from Senate 13. And then I'll run through our House candidates who are with us tonight. Barbara Blue from 37, Donald Bouchard, Hillsborough 11, Nancy Brucker, they're also from 37, Rich Bruno from Hillsborough 6, Rachel Sisto, Hillsborough 2, Jim Creighton from Hillsborough 38, Paul DeLuio from the 8th District, Sherry Dutzy from the 30th, Nikki Forty from 20, Dan Goldner, Hillsborough 8, Charles Hall from the 34th, Peter Hansen, the 22nd District, Tom Harris, the 27th, Mary Heath from the 14th District, Amanda Higgins from Hillsborough 45, Robert Kliske from Hillsborough 16, Donovan Boquette from Hillsborough 5, Megan Murray from Hillsborough 22, Lisa Nash, the 41st District, Cindy Parenti, the 21st District, Jen Pavelio from Hillsborough 2, and my apologies if I mispronounced that. I'm terrible at that, so I again apologize. Melanie Renfrew Hebert from Hillsborough 6, Catherine Rambeau, Rosemary Rung from Hillsborough 21, Herb Salmon from Hillsborough 23, Robert Sherman from the 37th, along with Alejandro Urrutia, also from that district, David Werner from Hillsborough 27, Suzanne White from Hillsborough 1, and Tim Wyatt from Hillsborough 37. Thank you all for being a part of tonight's event, and I know people are looking forward to hearing from you and your views, to hear your views on property taxes and school funding. Now, our event tonight will hopefully foster a greater understanding and an ongoing dialogue about New Hampshire's school funding system and the problems that plague it, as that system, in one way or another, touches the lives of just about everyone in the Granite State. New Hampshire's school funding system, needless to say, is of immense importance to to students in New Hampshire's public schools, represented here by this group of students from Berlin, who created this banner and marched in the local parade to call attention to the challenges that have faced their schools in recent years. School funding and property taxes are important as well to New Hampshire's homeowners, renters, and businesses. While they may support their local schools and recognize the value of investing in our shared future, are finding it harder and harder to do so over time as property taxes place an ever greater strain on their budgets. Now, in any discussion of New Hampshire's school funding and property taxes, we at the project think it's important to focus on three areas. The first is New Hampshire's constitutional responsibilities when it comes to school funding. The second is the role of the property tax in funding schools and the inequities that arise as a result. And the third is the enormous gap between actual school costs and state aid. And I want to touch on each of those subjects in turn. Now, I think as many folks on that are part of the event tonight understand or are aware, there have been a number of Supreme Court cases related to school funding over the past several decades, dating back in particular to the late 90s and the Claremont cases. And those cases and subsequent decisions have really established and clarified two fundamental responsibilities. First, that the state of New Hampshire has a duty to pay for the cost of a constitutionally adequate education for every K-12 public school student. And in the Londonderry case in 2006, that was clarified further still. Essentially, the court in that case ruled that whatever the state defines as constituting an adequate education, it must pay for. The second responsibility is that the taxes that the state of New Hampshire uses to pay for this education must have a uniform rate across the state. And the court has underscored the fact that that's true of the property tax, along with any other tax, but the property tax in particular. And it's really no surprise that it would speak to that, because property taxes, local property taxes, are really the driving force in funding public education in New Hampshire. Here we see in the 2018-2019 school year, about $3.3 billion in revenue flowed to local school districts. 73% of that came from local property taxes. Now, with such an overwhelming proportion related to that source, you might ask, well, why is that the case? And the reality is that New Hampshire as a state contributes less to its public schools than in any other state, thus forcing that heavy reliance upon local property taxes. Here we see the 50 states arrayed in terms of their contribution. On the far right, maybe the only times you'll hear the words far right associated with this, Hawaii and Vermont, which contribute more than 80% to their local school districts at the state level. In contrast, New Hampshire contributes only about 20% to its local school districts. If you were to count the statewide property tax, it goes up into the 30% range, but the statewide property tax is really just a relabeled local tax. And that reliance on property taxes has really only grown over time. Over the past decade, local property taxation for schools has increased by about $570 million. That dwarfs any other revenue source or growth in any other revenue source. State adequacy aid grew very modestly during that time by about $34 million, but that was offset to a large degree by declines in other state sources like school building assistance. Now, this reliance upon property taxes might not be such a problem if it were the case that the distribution of students throughout New Hampshire and the distribution of property values were the same. But as this table makes clear, they really are not. As a result, you end up with situations in which you have some communities that have comparatively high property values that use very low relative tax rates to generate revenue for school and are able to generate really substantial amounts of revenue for those kids. Take, for instance, Hillsborough. In 2018 and 2019, their equalized value per pupil, and that's really a measure to understand the resources that are available to educate children, their equalized value per pupil was over $7 million. As a result, their education property tax rate was less than $4 per thousand. Yet they were able to generate more than $26,600 on a per pupil basis for educating the kids in that community. Take a look near the bottom at a place like Newport. They had substantially lower property values that year and have for some time. Their equalized value per pupil was only about $555,000. As a result, they need to have much higher tax rates, about $15 per thousand. Yet the amount of revenue they raised on a per pupil basis was only about a third of that of Moltenboro at $8,300. Now, the state has done very little to sort of compensate for these. Well, before I make that point, let me say that this particular disparity in terms of property values has really grown as well over time. Here we see that state property values as a whole have grown by on the order of about 5% over the last decade. There are some communities where that growth rate has exceeded 40%, like Portsmouth, or close to 30%, like Hanover. Yet places like Pittsfield and Claremont have seen property values decline. And as a result, just to tread water when it comes to school funding, they need to continually rise property tax rates. So the state has really not done too much to try to address this problem and to offset these disparities. Here we have a table that lays out in a simplified form how state adequacy aid is calculated. And in the interest of time, I won't get into too many details, but I do want to call your attention to the two rightmost columns. On the far right, we see what districts actually spend on a per pupil basis. Just call your attention to Derry as an example. Derry for 2018-2019 spent about $15,300 on a per pupil basis. Yet under state law, under the adequacy formula that's used, the state said that Derry should be able to provide an adequate education on a per pupil basis for just $4,600 per student. And we haven't cherry picked these communities to sort of emphasize this gap. This is true throughout the state. And really to try to understand what that gap means between state aid and actual spending, we worked with officials in a number of school districts to go through an exercise and look at their budget and try to ask, what would you have to do to reduce your budget to get down to state adequacy? And it's really unbelievably extensive. So for the case of this example, we worked with Pittsfield, and in the 2018-2019 school year, their overall budget was about $10.3 million, or about $17,700 per student. For them, the state said that they should be able to provide an adequate education for $2.7 million all up, or about $4,600 per pupil. So what would you have to do to get down to that lower figure? And to start off with, we tried to keep core classrooms intact and really just strip away everything else. So there are 3 pages of cuts here, so I won't go into everything, but for the purposes of this exercise, school nurses were eliminated, all art, musical, and physical education classes. Secretaries were eliminated, all building and grounds maintenance, all foreign language courses, all struck away, all field trips, all athletic programs, all technology personnel, equipment, training, software, everything in that category, as well as guidance personnel, a substance abuse counselor, any sort of office supplies to keep the school running smoothly, the maintenance of the athletic field. And even after all of those hypothetical eliminations were made, Pittsfield's budget was still at $5.3 million, about twice of the state's adequacy level. So to get down to that adequacy level, we would have had to cut half of the remaining teachers and bring the student-teacher ratio to 60 to 1. That really begs the question of how anyone can believe that Pittsfield or any place else can provide an adequate education on the amount of state aid that they receive. Now, these facts, given the facts we've heard tonight, it really shouldn't come as much as a surprise that the most recent assessment of New Hampshire's school funding system, which was conducted by the American Institutes for Research in a draft report for the Commission to Study School Funding, really just confirmed these inequities. Um, Among its key findings were that the state's card system is inequitable from both student and taxpayer perspectives. The districts serving the highest proportion of students who are economically disadvantaged spend less on average, compared with districts serving the fewest such students. Moreover, the districts with the least property wealth per student impose the highest local education tax rates to be able to fund their children's education. So with that by way of background, I do want to turn to our guest speakers, but before I do, I had neglected to acknowledge two members of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project Board of Directors who are with us tonight, Chris Potter from Manchester and Doug Hall from Chichester. And when I say we did all those exercises, it was Doug who did all the heavy lifting there. And so I really want to thank them for being a part of tonight's event. So Liz, do you want to start us off?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that comprehensive overview. And I'd just like to precede my commentary just by saying that I did some of my own research and then some of my own calculations that did not take into consideration the complexities behind what Jeff just introduced to us. So I can always send my comments after if anyone would like to review how I came up with some of my own calculations, then that's no problem. So thank you, Jeff, again for hosting this with our state reps and and with other constituents. So my name is Liz Kerwin, and I'm an English learner teacher at West High School in Manchester. And this means that I specifically teach English language learners who are learning English. And I serve a really diverse set of students, and I'm really fortunate because Manchester is a refugee resettlement site. And so we serve, just within my school alone, almost 23% of the entire school population have a language other than English at home, which is really interesting. And it makes for a very strong school community, but it also changes the needs that we see within our students. I would just like to say that my internet has also been like on and off today. So if I freeze, please let me know and I can turn off my video.
Your video is kind of freezing up a little bit, but keep going. And if it happens again, we'll shut that down.
Okay, great. All right. So Jeff just presented that Manchester has a per pupil spending of about $12,300 for this 2019 and 2020 year. And if Manchester itself were funded at the state average of per pupil spending of around $16,000, Manchester would have a school system that would be the envy of the state. But our children are shortchanged about $54 million a year, year after year, because of this difference between what Manchester can fund per pupil and what the state average is. And we know that this is not adequate or equitable, and we need to strive for something more. The zip code in which my students live should not determine their future trajectory. And we know that the state needs to reevaluate this funding equation in order to equalize the equity between our tax-rich and our tax-poor municipalities. And like I said, I'm very lucky because I have 3 different perspectives within the Manchester School District as a parent, as an educator, and then also as a community advocate serving on different organizations. And so I've been able to see how the shortcomings of our current system, our current funding system, has affected students in different ways. And on a personal note, with my stepdaughter last year, she did have a mental health crisis at school, and there was a behavioral health counselor on staff. And so after the crisis, she was able to meet with this counselor frequently, in addition to her guidance counselor, and they were able to establish a plan and keep working forward. But because of inadequate funding within the Manchester schools, staffing levels were cut, and this behavioral health counselor was actually transferred mid-year to serve a different school within the district with other needs. And so schools in Manchester should not be forced to make decisions like this with detrimental impacts, like deciding whether or not to maintain a mental health counselor on staff for every school. And we need to recognize that this is really not an option, and that there are essential staff members at schools that are being cut or transferred because our adequate model is not sufficient. And luckily, we have, in my household, we have the ability to send my stepdaughter for other services, including therapy, but there are other students within the district that don't have those kind of opportunities, and they rely on the school system to serve these specific needs. And sometimes our school system cannot serve them. As an educator, we have to take into consideration the demographics of students in Manchester, especially those students that I serve, our English language learner population, who really face an overwhelming number of inequities each and every day. Our English language learner population at Manchester are refugees and also immigrants. And so our students have been through wars, they have gaps in their education, they have all these different experiences that we need to.
Liz, I think we may have lost you altogether. Can you hear me all right? So unfortunately, it looks like we, oh, Liz, you're breaking up quite a bit.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Oh, you did turn off my video, that's good.
Okay. Perhaps if you want to just finish that thought, we'll bring in Lisa.
Okay, sure. And our students do trust us in order to help them to realize their goals, and we know that our funding needs to be just as unique as the demographics that we serve within our school. Can I close on something from Manchester Proud?
Oh, please do.
Oh, okay, great. All right, as long as I still have connection. So, I've been really lucky to also be involved in Manchester Proud, which is which started as like a grassroots movement with community members and business professionals within the city that wanted to reinvest within our schools. And so they reached out and engaged more than 10,000 community members in Manchester to hold sessions about goals, about their needs within our schools. And then as a result, there are community members that are able to participate, and that's how I became involved, where we formed a community group to analyze these results from these sessions, listening to community members in order to construct the strategic plan that our district is now using in order to pull and change the trajectory of our schools. So this strategic plan has been approved by our Board of School Committee, and it has three major focuses of growing our learners, growing our educators, and growing our system. But we cannot meet these goals without strides toward equity with appropriate funding. And we know that New Hampshire towns and cities themselves are different in size and population, demographics, and socioeconomic levels. And we know that an equal state funding allocation affects these cities and these towns differently. The funding equation needs to be equitable to help more towns and more cities to equalize and make educational opportunities equitable for our students, who we know are the future leaders that will be leading us. And I just can't stress enough about the needs that we have within our schools and the differences that we see between our tax wealthy and our tax poor communities. So I'm sorry about the breakup. I had a few other comments, so I can definitely forward that along, but I want to thank you for your time and Jeff for hosting.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. Lisa?
Hi there, everyone.
Good evening.
Am I unmuted?
Nope, you're good.
All right. My name is Lisa Stone, and I live in Peterborough. I used to live in Manchester West. And so I had the unique experience of having a child graduate from West and having a child graduate from Conval. A totally different world, those two experiences were. It was interesting for Liz to mention mental health. At West, I think there was a part-time counselor, and at Conval, there were 5 full-time counselors, and a lot less students at Conval. And certainly, I'm sure that the need for mental health assistance for students was not different in those two schools. But I'm here today as a realtor, not as a mom. And
Lisa, I'm
so
sorry.
I have been, yeah.
You're breaking up a little bit. Maybe if
don't
you
like
were to
that.
turn off your video, the audio would
Yeah.
get resolved.
Yep. Rural internet, man.
Yeah, I can do it on. There we
Okay.
go. Great.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Thank you. So I wanted to just chat about what it was like to shop with a buyer in New Hampshire right now, so people can kind of get a feel. So, you know, most of the work in New Hampshire is in Manchester, Nashua. So I work with a lot of people who want to try and live within an hour from work, right? That seems reasonable for everyone. And it's quite interesting because someone who makes about $80,000 a year, which is the mean for Hillsborough County, they end up with a shopping budget of about $250,000. Unless, of course, they want to live in Peterborough, they can only spend $210,000. Or if they live in Claremont, they can spend $170,000. And why is that different? It's different because of the tax rate. So it's a very interesting process. So when I'm working with a buyer who's on a tight budget, I'm actually sending every single property that they want to send. I have to send it to the loan officer with the tax rate, with all this stuff, whether or not it's on public water, so we know whether or not there's a fire hydrant, you know, all this stuff, so they can come back and say whether or not they can afford that property. Now, if you look at that nationally, someone who earns $80,000 a year, if they were like to put it into a calculator on Zillow or Realtor.com and say, how much house can I afford? They would come back with, you can afford $350,000 worth of house. And the difference is that nationally, the income tax, the property tax is about 1% of the value of their home. And in New Hampshire, it's so much more than that. So personally, when I moved from Manchester to Peterborough and I bought a house that was $220,000 in the fall. So I hadn't yet received a tax bill. And when I got my first tax bill, my monthly taxes was more than my mortgage and insurance. So it's like crazy to me that when you just look at the way that's happening. And the biggest piece to that to me is that when I hear customers who bought last year and now during the pandemic, they've lost their job. So they've gone from earning, say someone earned $45,000 a year. Our unemployment is going to pay them an average right now, according to the unemployment website, is $265 a week. There's no way they can pay even their property tax. So, and it doesn't go away. They can't just say, oops, I can't do that this year. They can often negotiate their mortgage with their mortgage company, but that property tax, you know, continues strong no matter what happens in their life. And we see the same thing that happened with the elderly. They end up in homes that they can barely afford because of the property taxes. And then the homes start falling apart because they can't take care of them because they can't afford it. So I think that it's so clear to me that the way we do property taxes just creates such an unfair situation for homeowners. And as their life changes and their income changes because of a pandemic or because of getting older or someone gets injured at work, it makes it so they can't afford to own a home. And we want our schools to be great, but we got to figure out how to do it and make it so that it works. It like really works for families. And right now it doesn't.
Lisa, thank you so much for sharing that. Norm, you're up next. Norm, I believe you're still muted.
Okay,
Good
evening. I guess I'm here to offer a slightly different perspective. I'm a lifelong resident of New Hampshire, and I spent most of my career as president and CEO of Associated Grocers. And I'm not here, I should hasten. I've been retired for a number of years, so I don't pretend to be here as an official representative. I would like to just ask your indulgence to explain a little bit what Associated Grocers is, because it's an odd company. It's probably one of very few in the state that would be structured this way. It's a cooperative. And Associated Grocers was started 75 years ago by a group of small corner grocers, because back at that time, you only had small corner grocers. There were no Hannafords and Shaws and Market Basket and so on. Those were inconceivable back at that time. But what those small grocers saw is First National and A&P coming in and beginning to crush them because of their buying power. So they got together, they each threw a little money in the pot. They rented some old office warehouse space in Concord so as to try to have their own source of supply directly from manufacturers. The idea was terrific. The execution wasn't so good. And at the end of a year or two, they were technically bankrupt. Fortunately, their bank didn't know that. And they were able to recruit new management who turned things around. And today it's rather an amazing success. I say that, I suppose I have a dog in the race, so to speak, although I can't own any of the company, because the company still today is owned 100% by independent grocers. So Associated Grocers, in one sense, is a rather large company. We have a brand new 500,000 square foot distribution center in Pembroke, on which we pay $1 million a year in property taxes, I might add. So it's a large company with 1,000 employees, but it's owned by 300 small grocers who typically will employ 5, 10, 20, 30 employees. So it's a kind of a hybrid and consequently, I was able to see our school funding mechanism from the perspective of both a rather large employer and a small one. And I think we're sometimes told that, oh my heavens, if we do anything to endanger, quote, the New Hampshire advantage, unquote, it's going to be devastating. We're going to chase businesses away. Well, quite honestly, that's probably sounds nice as a piece of poetry. In reality, when we needed a new distribution center, we could go out and borrow $40 million and build it. We could buy or lease a fleet of tractors and trailers, computer equipment, mechanized warehouse equipment, and on and on and on. The one item that we couldn't simply write a check for is human skill. And that really, at Associated Grocers, as with most organizations, is the heart of the entire business. So I want to make a passionate plea that we really need to address school funding. And I will confess that even though I've lived here for pretty much my entire life, I always knew there were some issues around school funding, but it was not until I went to one of the Funding 101 classes that was held by John Tobin and Andrew Valinsky a couple of years ago, that I saw the presentation, or one very similar to the presentation that Jeff made at the opening of this session. And frankly, I was floored. I was astonished that our system is as upside down as it is. And it's remarkable that somehow our educators, despite that, still manage somehow to educate our kids. But I have to tell you the truth, there is no way that all the kids in the state of New Hampshire start with anywhere near an equal opportunity. I mean, I think I live in Bedford. I've lived in Bedford for 45 years. We have great schools. I think it's wonderful that kids in Amherst and Bedford and Hanover and Lyme and Portsmouth and Newcastle, fabulous education systems. I think we need to do the same for kids in Franklin and Claremont and Berlin and Gorham and Whitefield and the 100 other towns in the state of New Hampshire that don't have real estate of assessed value the way some of the wealthier towns do. And this is something that will be an asset to the businesses in the state of New Hampshire, not a liability. It will not chase businesses away. It will attract businesses to our state because every business is looking for a solid group of prospective employees. So I think, Jeff, that kind of wraps it up. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to stay on for a little bit. And
Great. And thank you, Norm, and thank you, Liz, and Lisa as well for sharing those insights with everybody tonight. Can't tell you how much we appreciate you being here. So with that, we're going to turn to our candidates. And again, we're going to proceed in alphabetical order. And we'll start with the Senate, the upper chamber, or the other body, as you'll soon come to reference it if you get elected. That means that Jennifer Alfred Teester will be our first speaker.
Hi, thank you so much for hosting this event tonight. I'm Jen Alfred Teester. I'm running for New Hampshire State Senate District 8, which covers 24 towns. And a lot of the towns that talk about are property poor, largely rural. I had 2 minutes. We have 2 minutes or 90 seconds?
Yeah.
Okay. So I had decided to run for office because I grew up here in the Granite State. I grew up here with a single mom who had 3 kids before she was 18. And my brother at 23. And so we lived in poverty my entire childhood. But I lived in a well-funded school district on the seacoast. So even though we were moving between a 2-bedroom apartment, the 6 of us, and between trailers and whatnot, we were attending a well-funded school district, what I believe was the foundation for my success as an adult. So when I turned 18, I had moved to North Carolina with $265 in 2 suitcases and didn't know what I was going to do with my life. And I, got a minimum wage job, making $4.35 an hour, got an undergraduate degree after passing out at work and not being able to eat. And the folks that I work for encouraged me to go to college. But in North Carolina, it was $2,000 a semester. So we'll fast forward to now. I'm a senior scientist at Dartmouth College with 2 master's degrees and a great salary. And I had realized in 2018 that I needed to show people the return on an investment that a well-funded public education gives kids. So, I may have grown up in poverty under difficult circumstances, but because of my well-funded public education, I'm now a success as an adult. And it's really important for people to see that return on investment because this work is so difficult and it's so hard to convince people that it's worth investing in children. Because children become the adults and the adults fill the economy and the jobs. And, and as someone who studies public health and is a geographer, and looks at, the social determinants of health and how that impacts people's, ability to succeed from, birth to death, public education and a well-funded education is one of those drivers of a successful life. So, that's why I'm such an advocate for a well-funded public education system, because I have the lived experience and the professional experience to speak to it. So thank you for putting on this event. Happy to be here with you tonight. Sorry about the chaos. My daughter and my husband came home. Her birthday's on Sunday. They had cupcakes and a SpongeBob and the dog was chasing it. So thank you for your patience.
Thanks for being with us and happy birthday to your daughter. Senator Deitch, you're up next.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you for putting this on, Jeff. I think it's important. I want to talk both to Norm and Lisa's points. So, on the one side, we've got the property taxes, but we need to look at why our property taxes are so high. I'm going to talk first about the education portion of that. And that is that at some point, and I forget exactly when, between 2000 and 2005, we decided that the children of the state no longer belong to the state, that each town is only responsible for the kids in their town. And that mindset is really what is behind a lot of the mismatch in the funding. So we've got to get rid of that mindset and think of all the kids in this state as belonging to us, as being our future, our state's future, and stop this nonsense about this kid, this wealthy town has 10 kids, and this other town has tens of thousands, and we're not going to share our resources. So that's the first problem is when that mindset went into effect. And that was something like 15 years ago. But in 2011, then after the downturn, we had cuts made in the revenue sharing to towns so that the portion of the teacher pensions no longer paid and so forth, municipal workers. And then we had cuts in the share of the rooms and meals tax that's shared with towns. Okay, so both of those hits were made because, according to the legislature at that time, led by Bill O'Brien, was that that was being done because we lacked revenues. But we got the revenues back, but we never went back to sharing. And so towns have been hit on both fronts, both by the state. Instead of giving back the towns what they'd previously had, we gave tax cuts to corporations, 4 of them, in fact, 4 tax cuts to corporations. And that was after the feds gave the tax, gave them a 14-point income tax break. So it's obvious that it's not just education that's causing the towns to hurt, Lisa. And as far as I'm of course a 3-time entrepreneur, you know, and have worked in economic development, and I am vice chair of Senate Education and Workforce. And we put education and workforce together because we know they're related. They're related not only because you're feeding into the corporations the talent that they need, but also the education is what attracts talent and families to New Hampshire. So I totally agree with Norm. Hi, Norm. Totally agree with Norm as far as the importance of education to our companies. And I know that being at the bottom in K-12 funding and being at the bottom in university funding and being at the bottom in the amount of research grants that we get back from the feds, even though we're near the top in the amount of federal taxes that we pay, all those things are harming our economy. And now I know I've gone way over my 2 minutes, so thank you, Jeff.
You beat me to the punch. Well, thank you so much, Senator. So our next speaker will be Barbara Blue. Barbara, you have the floor.
Okay, I'm Barbara Blue, and I'm running for a state representative from Hudson and Pelham. I chose to move to Hudson because I was concerned about education for my 2 children. I wanted them to have a good education. And I moved to New Hampshire in 1978, and I wanted my children to have a good education, and they did at that time. I felt a very good education from the Hudson school system, but I've noticed over the years that's changed. I have an education background. I have a master's in education from Rivier, and I taught in Westford, Mass for 2 years, and I taught at Manchester. And I noticed a big difference between Westford, Mass and Manchester, and the supplies and things they had, and how the schools were run. It was and Westford had the money to pay for what they needed, and Manchester did not. And I had a large number of refugee children that I worked with, and the stories I heard from those children just breaks your heart. They would just come up and tell me, you wouldn't believe what they tell me. I remember one little boy from Ukraine came up and said, "You know how they kill people in Ukraine? I know because I watched." And then he described these horrible things. And Manchester, it was lacking a lot of resources when I was teaching there, and I'm very concerned about education. And I really feel that we do need to find an alternative way of paying for education other than just property taxes. And that's one of my major reasons for running for state rep. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Our next speaker will be Donald Bouchard. Donald, you're still muted. There you go.
Hello, I'm a state rep from Manchester, and I'm also a retired physical science teacher with 45 years of experience, and all working in a property poor community. I found that this particular community try to compete with some of the up property rich communities. And so I was not able to afford to buy a home there because of the property taxes. So I do live in a property poor community as well. But now I'm looking for different types of solutions to make sure that the kids that are in the property poor community have the same opportunities that the kids that are in the property rich community have. First of all, I think maybe what we should do is, before we even discuss how much money we're going to spend, we should sit down and decide what the outcomes we expect our kids to have. And then we can find what's the cost and fund it adequately and equalize it. And I hope that's what we can do in the state legislature. And thank you, and I appreciate you inviting us and for setting this up.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Thank you for sharing your views. So next up is Rachel Sisto. Rachel?
Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel Sisto. I'm running for state rep in Hillsborough District 2, which is Ware and Deering. I come at this from a bit of a different perspective. I'm a relatively recent graduate of Ware's public schools, and I've seen what funding, or lack thereof in our case, means for the students in the school. I entered middle school in about 2003, right as officials were starting their conversation about building a new middle school. And the town was not interested. The school building failed time and time and time again until about 2006, when we opened up the building for tours and allowed community members to come in and see how the buildings, 2 of them, were not so great. At the time, the school was made up of 2 completely separate structures, 1950s era white building and 1970s era brick building. During the day, students usually had to run between the 2 buildings to try to get to various classes. And if it was raining or snowing, teachers would give us extra time, knowing that we had to pack up our coats or our umbrellas, or, to make the trek outside. And the switch was unavoidable because the library, the nurse's office, those were in the brick building. The gym, the cafeteria, those were in the white building. You really couldn't avoid it. In my 4 years at that school, I lost at least 4 academic days due to building conditions. So no power, no water, mold in the classrooms, electrical fires in the walls. There were 3 of those in my 4 years that I know of. There were probably more. And Ware isn't even the worst town on the list, but our property taxes are huge and through the roof, and the return for the students is very little. I've seen what it's like to be in a school that doesn't have enough. I've been in a school that's just trying to do the best it can with limited resources. But it didn't really hit me how bad it was until about 2018, and I took a job as a school portrait photographer. There were 3 of us based for the entire state of New Hampshire, so I was all over the place, from Ossipee to Portsmouth, Pittsfield to Manchester. And I rolled into Portsmouth Middle School one morning and was absolutely blown away. It looked like one of the buildings on my well-funded private college campus, not a public middle school. And at the time, I had just filed for my first run for state rep, and I was looking for all the information I could get. And it blew my mind as I looked into it how many schools in other towns didn't have to wonder if their budgets would pass. They didn't have to wonder if the teacher contract would be approved, or if necessary building maintenance would be completed, or if it'd be kicked down the road for another year until they couldn't avoid it. I wholeheartedly believe that we as a state need to reimagine how we fund public schools and redefine what's constitutionally adequate, because the education students receive should not be based on the zip code.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So our next speaker will be Sherry Dutsey. Is that correct?
Yes, Sherry Dutsey.
Dutsey, excuse me.
So I'm one of those people that was lucky to live in a good zip code. The zip code happened to be 48021, which was Michigan. And even though I'm 73 years old, I attended public kindergarten in which would have been, 1952. So when I moved to New Hampshire in 1970, I was appalled at the fact that we didn't have public kindergarten in New Hampshire in 1970. My brother and I would not have been able to go to college if we lived in New Hampshire. My parents had modest means, and we were lucky to attend both Michigan State, an excellent school, because it was publicly funded. My husband and I have both had jobs in Massachusetts where we have paid Massachusetts income tax. And I just cannot believe how resistant this state is to implementing some kind of fair income-based type of tax so that we can support the public education that we need. Frankly, I've done a couple of these studies, gone to some of these seminars, and we, always talk about what the problem is. I think it's well defined. We don't talk about how we're going to get to a solution. I'm a first-term state rep. I'm running for re-election, and I frankly cannot see what kind of tax base or tax that we're going to be able to come up with and agree on to be able to fund the education to the way it is. So I support public education totally, but I'm not optimistic that we're going to get here because this state is run by dedicated government workers and volunteers. And until we change that and start wanting to pay for the services that we demand, I just don't see how it's going to change.
Thank you, Sherry. Our next speaker is Charles Hall.
Hi, Jeff. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for putting this together and also inviting me. I don't have a great story to tell other than this is my first term, never ran for public office. I'm running in District 34 as a state rep. And I did early on in my campaign go around and talk to a lot of the constituents in my ward and here in Nashua and talk to them about what was important to them. Because I'm basically running my campaign on not what I need, but what they need. And there was a common theme. One is property taxes are extremely high and quality of education is not where it should be. And the reason why I joined this is I'm in a fact-finding mission because this is basically new to me and I appreciate everybody's input. It's quite valuable to me at this point. But what I did find out is this issue has been going on for at least 20 years with no resolution. So my take on this is, based on what I've heard from everybody, I think everybody is on the same page. We need a solution. And the solution is twofold. You have one side, you need a quality education for all of the students in New Hampshire, not just Nashua or Claremont or any other place. It's got to be the standard. When it says adequate education, I need a really, really defined explanation of what an adequate education is. Is it based on the needs of the community? Is it based on some metric of educational excellence? I can't get my hand on it. So I think we need to start with that. What does it mean? And then take a look at how do you get the funds to provide that education? One of the metrics I did look at from a budgeting standpoint is the cost per student. And I think to really break this down and come to grips with how you fund this is what's the direct cost to adequately educate a student, and then what are the indirect costs? Because across the state, what I've seen is the indirect costs in some cases are equal to or greater than the direct cost of educating the student. How do you move the money from the indirect cost, lower that and move it over? Taxation is probably a supplemental, but it may not be the answer. And I think a lot of the people in my ward are opposed to any income tax or state tax because they don't believe that the money they currently have is being adequately spent. They don't understand how it's spent, and they don't know where the money goes. Whether they've chosen not to dig into it like I did, or it's a fact they don't know where it goes. When I looked, it's hard to tell exactly where the money goes. So appreciate everybody's input. I'm on a fact-finding mission. When elected, I'm certainly going to go to Concord and help with the problem.
Thank you for sharing. Tom Harris, Not seeing you on screen. Let me see. I think our next speaker would be Robert Kliske. Robert?
Hi, everyone. How are you? My name's Robert Kliske. I'm running for state representative in Manchester's Ward 9. As you can tell, I'm fairly young. I'm 24 years old, running for my first term in the State House. And I graduated from Manchester Memorial High School in 2014, so I feel like I've had very recent experience with the Manchester public school system, as well as going to a college out of state in Rhode Island and seeing how it is there as well. I was fortunate enough growing up to go to St. Thomas Aquinas from kindergarten to 8th grade. Thankful my parents paid for my tuition to go there and get a good foundation, and then just helped me excel further in the public schooling. However, when there, I could see the failings, whether not being funded enough or essentially just not having the resources to cater to everyone's needs, as Manchester is a very diverse city. And so teaching me is very different than teaching someone whose English may not be their first language. And obviously you need the resources in order to cater to everyone's educational needs. And I'm very big into solutions. I'm a solutions-oriented person. And the one that I've been advocating for the most is sports gambling. Granted, gambling itself is an addiction, and we need to provide resources to make sure people don't get addicted to it. However, in just the Super Bowl this year alone, in New Hampshire, it raised more than $1.2 million just wagered, just for one single game. And I understand because of COVID, it shut down all of sports. But in a general year, it's projected to bring in over $10 million to the New Hampshire Educational Fund. And just down the road, they opened up a DraftKings sports center where essentially you can go in and it's a sports book where you can go and place bets in person. And I believe that's just one step that we're taking to increase the funds going in without creating additional taxes. My whole thing is I graduated college. Everyone in my age group right now is trying to buy homes. However, property taxes are a main reason as to why we can't afford them. We can afford the sticker price. However, the property taxes puts us over budget, and it's almost impossible to get approved for a mortgage when you factor in the high property taxes. And so if when elected, I hope to not only increase that one solution, but work across the aisle and come up with other creative solutions in order to generate funding that doesn't come out of the taxpayers' essentially wallet. And then that way, hopefully lowering property taxes as well. And that's all I got.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. I believe our next speaker is Lisa Nash. Lisa?
Oh, hi, thank you. My name is Lisa Nash. I'm running for state representative in District 41, which represents Bedford and Amherst. So hi, neighbor Norm, nice to meet you and see you on this call. First, I just would like to applaud the commission for all of the work that they've been doing on this, and really for bringing in the community and including them in the conversation, because that's really, really important. I've lived in Bedford for 21 years. I have 4 children who've gone through the public school system here. And as I've heard a couple of times this evening, you know, Bedford is known for having a really quality school system. But I can tell you that since we built our high school, the property tax issue has been really amplified. And we have a lot of people in town who are saying enough is enough. I don't want to have to leave my home of 40 or 50 years because I can't afford the property taxes. So I think this is an issue that's going to take cooperation across party lines. I think we are seeing an urgency because of the inequities. COVID has really shown a spotlight on places that don't even have access to internet, so you can't do the remote learning and all of these things. I think they're all really interconnected, and I think we really need to find a solution that works better for students, for property owners, for businesses, for all of us. So I don't want to talk too long because I know there's a lot of other people waiting to talk, but I just really appreciate this opportunity to listen and learn from all of you, what's going on where you are and all of your perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa is actually the last of the candidates who have indicated previously that they wish to speak. I believe there are a few other candidates on the call. If you have had a change of heart and want to share any views with us, please just raise your hand either physically or virtually, and we can let you know. So Suzanne, you just beat out Jen, so I'll recognize you first and then Jen afterwards.
Thanks. Again, I want to add my thanks to all of you for putting this together and for everything that you've said. There's so many things that folks have already said that I am totally supportive of, but we have an opportunity because of COVID to reimagine how we deliver education. And I think that we could, first of all, I like the idea of redefining an adequate education. I think it needs to be brought up to date, and I think it needs to be reviewed at least every 5 years because technology changes so much, and we need to have a workforce that is capable of managing the demands of the new technology changes. The second thing is that we could reallocate resources within the schools, I think. We could do magnet classrooms. We could do, without doing charter schools, but we could allow different paths within the schools for children to follow their bents, whether it's science and technology, engineering, math, arts and sciences. There are opportunities, and I think we need to look at a really broad range of solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Jen, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jen Pavelio. I'm running for state rep in Hillsborough District 2, along with Rachel Sisto. And Lisa, I think that we have the same necklace. I think I noticed that. It's in the New Hampshire. Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to quickly say the reason that I decided to run for state rep. I live in Ware. I've lived in Ware for the better part of the last 30 or so years. I actually graduated from John Stark. I went to Ware Middle School, and a lot has changed since then. John Stark used to be ranked in the top 10 schools in the state. I'm not sure where we're at right now, but the reason that I decided to run is because I started to see our budgets failing for our schools. And I mean, I realize that people don't want their property taxes to go up. And that's where I decided that it needs to change. If our schools fail, we all fail. Education is the key to economic success. And I believe that our kids deserve a good education no matter where they live. And I'm hoping to get to the State House to be able to make a difference. So thank you, guys.
Thank you. Are there any other candidates with us tonight who would like to be recognized to speak for a few minutes? All right, well, great. So why don't we turn to questions from the audience. For folks who are listening in, please don't hesitate to enter your questions into the Q&A feature, and we'll share those with the candidates. As I mentioned, we did have a few sort of pre-registration type questions, and so I'll pose the first one. It's from Christine Fajardo from Manchester, and this is an issue that some folks have touched on already, but if you haven't had a chance to weigh in, please do. And her question is, how do you view the connection between our schools and the local economy? Is there anyone who would like to respond to that question? Senator Deitch, we'll give you a first crack in.
Well, the very first thing a family asks when they're moving, as Lisa Stone knows, is how great is the school district? That's a key driver in people moving in to a district. In addition, the school will have relationships, internships with local businesses, in our case, New Hampshire Ball Bearing, Millipore, the paper mill. And that's how we feed, of course, into the businesses. And having those kinds of relationships, and with Franklin Pierce too, the colleges are key drivers. But it's those kind of relationships that make a strong economy. And if you look at the strongest economies in our nation and where kids love to go, where talent and workforce grows, and where entrepreneurship grows, it's around the largest research universities in the nation.
Thank you. Are there other candidates who'd like to speak to this question? Rachel, go ahead.
Well, I think it's, as has been alluded to, families move where schools are good. When you have towns that have schools that are struggling, that are, they become less attractive for young families trying to move in, and it sort of depletes not only, your base in town, but also, local businesses. We're seeing that a lot. A lot of young families and kids are graduating and they're just leaving. There's nothing here for me, and they're leaving. And that sort of limits the base that the town has to try to, get people in businesses, to try to start businesses, to have staff for these businesses. And it's all a cycle. And it starts with people looking at the schools and going, well, that's a really good school, I'm going to move there.
Thank you. Robert, go ahead.
So also the one thing that I also really think is important is that quality public schools directly correlate to economic development. Because if you think about it, a quality public school helps improve the human capital of the current area, which in turn turns that geographical location into hopefully a hub of where businesses want to come in and invest money into the area, because we have such a rich and hopefully prosperous educational system. And so I feel that that's just an additional advantage that we can take advantage of, that if your education is really good, then companies will want to come here, and then you don't even have to go to college, and you can go straight to the workforce and start working for companies and hopefully limit debt. So.
Thank you. And Barbara, go ahead.
Yes, I noticed that in Hudson also. I've heard several high school students say that almost everyone they know, when they leave school, they're never going to return to Hudson. They want to live somewhere else because the property taxes are too high. They complain. And the schools, they don't feel the schools are good enough for their children. And a lot of people are leaving Hudson for that reason.
Let's see. Are there other candidates who would like to respond to the question? Sherry?
Yeah, this was a story that was told, I think it was in 2018 by Steve Marchand when he was running for governor. And he had talked about a company moving into Rochester and having created 400 jobs. And these were well-paying jobs. He went back to that company about a year and a half or 2 years later and asked them how they were doing in terms of hiring people. And they were quite discouraged because they had only hired 200 of the 400 people. And he said, why was that? And it was because people would be coming and looking at the jobs. And when they found out what the school system was in Rochester, they decided that it wasn't in their best interest to take that job because they were coming in from a different state. And the whole reason to come here was to be able to work and live in the same community. If the schools in Rochester weren't up to speed, then they were going to have to be moving 45 minutes to an hour away in a better community. They would have the same commute, or they would have to put their child into a private school. And so the advantages of moving here, didn't materialize. And so one of the focuses they did was to focus on creating better schools in Rochester, and they looked at that whole thing. But there is a direct correlation. Anybody that you talk to who has school-age children, and the first thing they're going to say is it's schools, schools, schools. And if we want to attract the talent from across the country to New Hampshire, and it was my husband and I that came from California to settle here, in the 70s, and there were a lot of people at that time. It's all about the schools, and those are the people that we want coming to our state.
Thank you. So we do have one question from someone who had pre-registered who's here tonight, and if she's willing, I'm going to recognize her now to pose it directly. Janine, would you be willing to share the question that you had wanted to ask?
Sure. So one of the reasons when we start, I'm on the Conval School Board, And as you probably know, we have a lawsuit right now that we're waiting for a decision from the Supreme Court on. We had a decision from the lower court, but the state contested it. But, you know, when we started this whole process, one of the things that we thought about was we knew we were asking the legislature for a very heavy lift, because it would be impossible to solve this funding problem without new revenue streams. I've heard different plans. I've seen the heirs planned. We've had something similar like that before, but when a new legislature was voted in, they changed that funding formula because the towns with the higher property values did not want to fund the towns with the lower property values. So, you know, my question is who is willing to support the development of new revenue streams that could actually make this funding problem a reality? It's a problem that states right across the country face. New Hampshire just happens to be the worst. So I guess that's what I put before the people that are running for our legislature and our current members. Most probably, we are going to need some kind of new revenue in order to solve this problem. So my question is anybody willing to support that?
Yes.
Thank you,
I
Jeannie.
am.
Why don't we, I see Sherry and Barbara have their hands up. I do want to give other folks a chance to respond if they haven't had a chance to yet. Donald, were you stretching, or did you want to respond to the question? Lisa Nash, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, Ginny, thank you so much for that question. I don't have a great answer, and I don't have a yes or no response to you. I'm not a current legislator. I hope to win. I hope to be in there making some of these decisions, but I will just say one of the concerns I have is that we're going to see a loss in revenue from COVID, and I've been talking to people across a lot of different industries that are going to be needing support, and they know that they're going to be asked to be cutting their budgets to like vital services. So I just have a concern, and I think it's just really important that we get this right, because I think the next 2 years we're gonna have kind of ripple effects from COVID impacting a lot of different industries. So it's not an answer to your question. I'm just throwing that out there as something I'm thinking about when we're talking about new revenue streams, because I think we're going to be really pulling in the purse strings on a lot of services. So not helpful, but.
You know, I totally agree with you. I mean, this question we've been at this for about 1.5 years now, and before COVID even started. Our reopening plan for COVID was seen across, not only in this state, but other states, as being one of the best. But the expense of it has been very difficult, and we are really afraid of future budgets. So yes, it's made everything a lot more complicated. And I'm sure the state budget's going to be in the same boat.
Thank you, Janine. Councilor Pignatelli, is there something you wanted to offer?
I have a question for probably Doug Hall. Doug, you've been in the legislature for quite a while, and so have I, and we have been talking about education funding and trying to make decisions and determine what adequacy means. I'm wondering if you could give us a history of what has happened in the legislature in terms of the state funding of education.
Yeah, we've been involved for quite a while. I was involved initially, even before the Claremont suits. And there was another lawsuit that many people don't remember that came before that. But if you go back in the history, something that most people don't realize is that from the time of the American Revolution and the establishment of the state of New Hampshire as a state, it was the state legislature that every couple of years voted how much each town had to raise for its schools. It was not the local people. It was not the Board of Selectmen. It was the state legislature. And that's why the Constitution, the New Hampshire Constitution, makes it a state responsibility, because that's what they did. It was only after 1900 that towns began to add more money to what the state required. And once towns started adding more money, voting more money than the state requirement, then the state legislature said, essentially, well, I guess we don't have to do that anymore. So what we have all experienced personally in the last, in my case, 77 years, is not the way the state started out. And the state is struggling with the question, and has since the Claremont lawsuit. The state has been struggling with the question of, well, how do we pay for an adequate education when we don't have much money to do so? And so the state answer through the legislature has been to woefully underestimate what the cost of an adequate education is. If you could provide an adequate education for $4,000 per pupil, the state could live up to its end of the deal. But you can't do that, and the state essentially refuses to raise that number, which is one of the arguments that the Conval School District is making. They claim that it should be $9,900 per pupil, but in fact, many districts would require more than that because they have needier students. So the history is one that a lot of us don't fully recognize, that the state legislature actually was responsible for the funding of all schools in the state for more than 100 years.
Thank you, Doug. So I think we've got time for one more question. I do want to pick up on something that Lisa touched upon. So as I'm sure all of you are aware, particularly if you are currently serving in the legislature, one of the most important things that the legislature does during its time in office is to pass a state budget for the upcoming biennium. And in the coming legislature, the process of crafting a budget promises to be exceptionally challenging because of the circumstances related to COVID. If you were elected, how high a priority would it be for you to maintain state education aid at its current levels? Don't everyone jump in at once.
Oh, I wasn't sure if that was to me.
No, that's for everybody. Sorry, Lisa, I wasn't thinking on you.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, sure. So basically, one of the chief tasks of the legislature every session is to pass the budget. And the next budget is admittedly going to be quite difficult because of the circumstances created by COVID. And so I'd be curious to hear, and I think the people listening in and the people who will watch this video later, would be curious to hear sort of what kind of priority you'll put on education funding in the budget when difficult choices need to be made.
I can say for myself, it's one of my top 3 priorities is to protect our public education. I mean, I put it on all of my mailers. I talk about it every campaign event I go to, public education, and also the integration of trades and apprenticeship work in our district, which would, in my mind, and I think we have an opportunity here to expand on building our workforce here through trades and apprenticeship, which I see is connected to high school and high school education. So it's one of my top 3 priorities. I think it is the biggest return on investment that we can make with our state dollars, and we should be acting like that.
Thank you. Suzanne, go ahead.
Building on what Jen said, as far as the trades are concerned, we could do public-private partnerships with the trade unions, I think, and find ways for youngsters to get out of high school with a way to earn a living for themselves without having to mortgage their futures to go to college. So at a later date, they could go to college, but they don't have to go into debt forever. They can start making a living as soon as they graduate.
Great. And, Sherry, I think you have your hand raised there.
Yeah, our caucus last year rated different programs that we had a priority for spending, and education was the top of it. So if I am reelected, and we did support increased funding in this last budget. I know the coming years are going to be very tight and difficult, but for me, the return on investment is so high that it would be my highest priority.
Thank you. Barbara, go ahead. And then we'll
Yes.
take Charles.
Okay. The education is my top priority on my platform. And the main reason I'm running for state legislature. To me, we have to have our children well educated, and that's worth any amount of money. But and it's vastly important that we find other sources of revenues to pay for this education. And that's one of my top core values. And I want my grandchildren to have the same education that my children had, that I had as a child.
Thank you. Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with everyone. Shortchanging our education and our students is a long term. The price is way too high. One of the things though that I wanted to bring up, I looked at some information, and as I was listening to the group, again, I'm on a fact-finding mission here, but one of the things that I did see is the bulk of our education right now comes from taxpayers, residents, property taxes. But I can remember back, and here I am dating myself, but in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a technical boom in southern New Hampshire. High-tech companies were moving in. I had 1,500 people, 9 managers and at least 30 supervisors managing 1,500 manufacturing people in southern New Hampshire. Those jobs all left. And what I'm looking at now is there is no shared cost between large corporations in New Hampshire and the taxpayers. That's gone. There's a huge amount of spending by corporations, and some of the headquarters are still here. The manufacturing is gone. The other thing I compared was those salaries that those direct labor manufacturing people were paid in 1985, 1988, 1990 were equal, if not higher, than some of the middle class workers are paid today. That's a huge problem. And that's a piece of the equation that really needs to be addressed. How do we get large companies into New Hampshire, not just southern, spread across the state, make it advantageous for large companies to come into our community? The problem we're having is the companies don't want to come because we don't have the schools for their children, the property taxes. Those problems have to be addressed at some point to attract not only the business, but the labor force that they need to hire to keep their businesses viable. So I'm gonna take a close look at that.
All right, thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to have the last word? Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm 100%. We cannot reduce adequacy funding when we're looking at the budget. That has just got to be a priority. So yeah, I commit to making sure that does not get reduced, and hopefully we will have some better ideas on how we can address the issues that we were talking about tonight. So to answer your question, 100%, we've got to make sure we are not reducing that number.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think we're nearing the end of our time together, and I did want to thank everyone who took part tonight. Our guest speakers, Norm Turcott and Liz Kerwin, who had to jump off because of teaching responsibilities, Lisa Stone, but in particular, I want to thank all of you, as well as the voters from Hillsborough who have joined us tonight. And I think really we've had a terrific give and take, and I hope that we'll be able to continue that following the election, whether you should succeed or if someone else should, but because we want to keep this conversation going. So again, just as a reminder, my name is Jeff McLynch, and I'm with the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. I do want to mention there are a couple ways that you can connect to us if you'd like to continue to be a part of this effort. Our website is fairfundingnh.org, and you can email us at info@fairfundingnh.org. And I do want to mention, I think somebody alluded to this a little bit earlier, we love to talk. We love to talk, and in non-pandemic situations, I love to drive. And so we would love to come out to your neighborhoods. Granted, Hillsborough isn't too far from where I live, but we would love to come out to your communities and talk about this subject to anybody you might want, to your local Rotary, to your local Chamber of Commerce, to the school board, select board, you name it. They used to say he'd be at the opening of an envelope. Well, that's true for us too. And so please, whether it's virtually or in person, we'd love to come and speak with any group that you might be a part of. So you can make those requests at info@fairfundingnh.org. And you can also follow us on social media, particularly Twitter. We are at fairfundingnh on that particular platform. So I really want to thank everybody, and I hope we'll be able to continue to work together into the future. And I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.